Two attorneys boarded a flight out of Seattle. One took the window seat, the other sat in the middle. Just before takeoff, a physician boarded and settled into the aisle seat next to them. Feeling comfortable, the doctor kicked off his shoes and stretched his feet. Moments later, the attorney by the window said, "I think I'll get up and grab a Coke." The physician smiled. "No worries, I'll grab it for you." As soon as he walked off, the attorney picked up one of the doctor's shoes and spat in it. When the doctor returned with the Coke, the other attorney said, "That looks good. I think I'll have one too." Again, the doctor kindly went to fetch it. While he was gone, the second attorney grabbed the other shoe and did the same. When the physician returned, they all sat back, sipped their drinks, and enjoyed the flight. But as they landed, the doctor slipped his feet into his shoes and immediately realized what had happened. Sighing, he shook his head and muttered, "How long must this childish feud go on? Lawyers versus doctors, attorneys spitting in shoes, doctors pissing in Cokes." A destitute man wandered the streets, desperate for work. Eventually, he stumbled upon a brothel with a "Help Wanted" sign in the window. Hopeful, he stepped inside and asked the manager about the job. "Well," the manager said, "we need a bookkeeper, but there are some basic skills required." "Like what?" the man asked. "Well, can you read?" "No." "Can you write?" "No." "Can you at least do basic math?" The man shook his head. "No, sir, but I'm desperate. I haven't a penny to my name, and I'm starving." The manager sighed and reached into his pocket. "Well, I can't hire you, but here, take this quarter. Get yourself something to eat." The man thanked him and walked outside, where he spotted a vendor selling apples for 25 cents each. He bought one, but just as he was about to take a bite, another hungry man walked by. "I'll give you 50 cents for that apple," the man offered. Seeing an opportunity, the destitute man agreed. With his newfound wealth, he bought 2 more apples and sold them at a profit. He kept reinvesting, and over time, his apple business grew. Years later, he became the owner of the largest fruit shipping company in the country, amassing a fortune worth millions. One day, a journalist uncovered his inspiring rags-to-riches story and decided to write an article about him. Before publishing, the journalist handed him a contract. "I just need your signature to proceed." "Well, I can't do that," the man said. The journalist looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "I never learned to read or write." Stunned, the journalist shook his head. "You built an empire without knowing how to read or write. Imagine where you'd be if you could." The man chuckled. "Oh, that's easy. I'd be a bookkeeper at a brothel." One Sunday morning, a young man strutted into the local coffee shop, dressed sharply and carrying an air of superiority. He lazily took a seat, glanced around, then snapped his fingers to summon a waiter. "I want your freshest coffee," he demanded. "None of that muddy stuff you probably brew from yesterday's leftovers." The waiter smiled politely. "Sir, we make fresh coffee several times a day." "I'll believe it when I taste it," the man scoffed. "I'm from New York, and I know good coffee. Frankly, I doubt you got anything close, so at least make a new batch for me." He waved the waiter away dismissively. Sighing, the waiter went to the kitchen and returned with a steaming cup. The man took a sip and immediately made a disgusted face. "Just as I thought, not fresh. Try again." The waiter, now slightly annoyed, returned to the kitchen. This time, he took his time before emerging with another cup, steaming, rich, and aromatic. The man took a sip and immediately spat it out. "This is even worse. This coffee tastes like mud." The waiter blinked, then shrugged. "Well, sir, it's fresh ground." One day, James was walking downtown when he spotted his old high school friend Harry up ahead. "Harry! Hey, how are you?" James called out, happy to see him. "Not so good." Harry sighed. "Why? What happened?" "I just went bankrupt," Harry admitted, "and I still have to feed my family. I don't know what I'm going to do." James nodded thoughtfully and said, "Could have been worse." A month later, they ran into each other again at a restaurant. James greeted him. "Hey, Harry, how are things now?" "Terrible," Harry groaned. "Our house burned down last night." James, ever composed, replied, "Could have been worse." Then he finished his meal and went on his way. Another month passed, and James bumped into Harry once more. "Harry, how's it going?" "Oh, just awful," Harry exclaimed. "First I went bankrupt, then my house burned down, and now my wife has left me." James, as usual, smiled and said, "Could have been worse." This time, Harry had had enough. He grabbed James by the shoulders. "Wait a minute. Every time we meet, I tell you my life is falling apart, and all you say is it could have been worse. This time, I want a real answer. How exactly could it have been worse?" James gave him a calm smile. "Well, it could have happened to me." An 83-year-old Canadian gentleman arrived in Paris by plane. As he reached the French customs desk, he fumbled through his carry-on, searching for his passport. The customs officer, watching impatiently, asked with a hint of sarcasm, "Have you been to France before, monsieur?" The elderly man nodded. "Yes, I have." "Then you should know to have your passport ready." The Canadian paused, then calmly replied, "The last time I was here, I didn't have to show it." Scoffing, the officer said, "Impossible! Canadians always have to show their passports upon arrival in France." The old man gave him a long, steady look and said quietly, "Well, when I came ashore at Juno Beach on D-Day in 1944 to help liberate this country, I couldn't find a single Frenchman to show it to." A woman arrived home to find a letter from her husband on the dining table. Curious, she opened it and read, "My dear wife, you will surely understand that I have certain needs that you, as a 54-year-old, can no longer satisfy. I am very happy with you and value you as a wonderful wife. However, I hope you will not misinterpret the fact that I will be spending the evening with my 18-year-old secretary at the Comfort Inn. Please don't be upset. I shall be home before midnight. Sincerely, your loving husband." That night, the man returned home feeling rather pleased with himself until he spotted a reply waiting for him on the table. He picked it up and read, "My dear husband, I received your letter and appreciate your honesty about my being 54. I would like to take this opportunity to remind you that you are also 54. That said, I would like to inform you that while you read this, I will be at the Hotel Fiesta with Michael, one of my students, who also happens to be an assistant tennis coach. He is young, athletic, and, like your secretary, 18. You, being a successful businessman with an excellent understanding of math, will surely appreciate this simple equation. 18 goes into 54. A lot more times than 54 goes into 18. See you tomorrow, darling. Sincerely, your loving wife." The police detectives were struggling to get their suspects to confess. No matter how hard they pressed, they couldn't determine guilt with certainty. Then they heard about a telepath, a man rumored to be able to instantly tell if someone was guilty of a crime. Skeptical but desperate, they decided to consult him. They brought in their first suspect. The moment he stepped into the room, the telepath said, "This man is guilty. He murdered a pizza delivery guy who was bringing food to his house." The detectives exchanged stunned glances. "How could he know that? We never even mentioned the case." They brought in the next suspect. Without hesitation, the telepath said, "This man is innocent. He was framed for burglary by his next-door neighbor, Bill Summers." The cops were dumbfounded. "This guy's unreal. We didn't tell him a thing." Still, they wanted to test him. To be sure he wasn't just lucky, they brought in a beautiful woman, someone they knew had never committed a felony. An officer accompanied her into the room. The telepath took one look and said, "This woman is guilty of theft." The officer scoffed. "Aha! We got you. She's clean. We only brought her in to test you. You're a fraud." The detectives dismissed the woman, shaking their heads. As she walked out, the telepath casually remarked, "I'd catch up to her if I were you." The officer frowned. "And why is that?" The telepath smirked. "Because she just stole your wallet." A woman was having an affair when one rainy afternoon she was in bed with her lover and suddenly heard her husband's car pulling into the driveway. Woman, "Oh my God, hurry, grab your clothes and jump out the window." Lover, "Are you crazy? It's pouring out there." Woman, "If my husband catches us, he'll kill us both." With no time to argue, the lover grabbed his clothes and leapt out the window, right into the pouring rain. As he sprinted down the street, he realized he had accidentally joined the town's annual marathon. Now surrounded by 300 runners, he had no choice but to keep going. After a while, a few curious runners jogged up beside him. Runner 1. Do you always run naked? Lover. Oh, absolutely. It feels so wonderfully free. Runner 2. And do you always carry clothes under your arm? Lover. Of course. That way I can get dressed at the finish line and go home. A third runner gave him a long, puzzled look, then finally asked. Runner 3. Okay, but do you always wear a condom when you run? The lover sighed and said, nope, only when it's raining. A man boarded his flight and settled into his seat. As he got comfortable, he noticed an incredibly beautiful woman making her way down the aisle. His heart skipped a beat when he realized she was heading straight for him. To his amazement, she took the seat right beside him. Eager to make conversation, he blurted out, business trip or vacation? She turned, smiled, and said, business. I'm heading to the annual Sexual Studies Convention in Chicago. He swallowed hard. The most gorgeous woman he'd ever seen was going to a convention about sex? Struggling to keep his cool, he asked, oh, and what's your role at the convention? Lecturer, she replied. I share research and personal experience on human sexuality. Intrigued, he leaned in. Really? Like what? She smiled. Well, for instance, studies show that Native American men are the most passionate lovers. Jewish men are the most skilled at fully satisfying a woman, and surprisingly, Southern rednecks tend to last the longest. As she finished, she blushed slightly. I'm sorry, I really shouldn't be discussing this with a stranger. I don't even know your name. The man grinned, extended his hand, and said, Tonto Goldstein, but my friends call me Bubba. A senator visits a primary school and asks the students if anyone can give him an example of a tragedy. One little boy stands up and says, if my best friend who lives next door is playing in the street and a car comes by and kills him, that would be a tragedy. The senator shakes his head. No, that would be an accident. A girl raises her hand. If a school bus carrying 50 children drove off a cliff and everyone died, that would be a tragedy. The senator, still unconvinced, responds, I'm afraid not. That would be a great loss. The room falls silent. The students are now reluctant to speak. The senator presses on. What? Isn't there anyone here who can give me an example of a tragedy? Finally, little Johnny, sitting in the back, hesitantly raises his hand. Yes, Johnny? Asks the senator. Johnny meekly replies, if an airplane carrying a senator were blown up by a bomb, that would be a tragedy. The senator beams. Marvelous! And why would that be a tragedy? Johnny grins and says, 'Cause it wouldn't be an accident and it sure wouldn't be a great loss. During his Sunday sermon, the preacher's topic was, forgive your enemies. After a long, passionate sermon, he asked, how many of you are willing to forgive your enemies? About half the congregation raised their hands. Not satisfied, he pressed on for another 20 minutes, urging them further. He repeated the question, and this time, 80% of the hands went up. Still not content, he gave another 15-minute lecture, then asked again. This time, every hand shot up, except one elderly lady sitting in the back. Mrs. Jones, the preacher called out, are you not willing to forgive your enemies? I don't have any, the old lady replied. Mrs. Jones, that's incredible. How old are you? 97, she said, smiling. 97? Wow! Mrs. Jones, please, come up here and tell the congregation how you've managed to live all these years without having any enemies. Slowly, she shuffled to the front, turned to face the congregation and said, it's easy. I just outlived the bastards. A man walks into a zoo and asks to speak to the director about their new Rent an Animal program. The zoo has fallen on hard times, so they're renting out some of their animals during off hours. The man is clear about what he wants. I'll take an elephant, the biggest one you've got. An elephant? The director asks, a bit surprised. Sure, we can do that, but it won't be cheap. It's $5,000 a day, plus $4,000 for transportation. And you'll need to feed the elephant yourself. That's fine, the man replies, handing over $10,000 up front. The elephant is delivered to the man's house, But when the workers try to get the elephant inside, it doesn't fit through the door. The man, unfazed, calls a construction company and rents a crane to lift the elephant through the window at great expense, and then has the window resealed. At this point, the zoo director, who's been following the situation, asks, "I have to know, what's all this for?" The man smiles and explains, "Well, my brother-in-law is living with us, and he's a total know-it-all. He's a walking trivia machine, always blurting out the answers before anyone has a chance to guess. He beats me at every game, even crossword puzzles. So tonight, he'll go upstairs, come down and say, 'Guess what? There's an elephant in my bedroom.' And I'll just look up from my book and say, 'Yes, I know.'" One night, a man and a woman are at a bar, enjoying a few beers. After a while, they strike up a conversation and discover they're both doctors. The man, feeling bold, says, "How about we sleep together tonight? No strings attached, just one night of fun." The woman agrees, and they head back to her place. He goes to the bedroom, and she heads to the bathroom, where she spends about 10 minutes scrubbing up, as though she's preparing for surgery. Finally, she enters the bedroom, and they have a passionate hour together. Afterward, the man says, "You're a surgeon, aren't you?" "Yeah, how did you know?" she replies. "I could tell by the way you scrubbed up before we started." She smiles and says, "That makes sense. You're an anesthesiologist, aren't you?" "Yeah, how did you know?" he asks, a bit surprised. She chuckles and replies, "Because I didn't feel a thing." One day, a woman was chatting with her friend, and the conversation took an unexpected turn. The woman said, "You know, I have to be extra careful to make sure I don't get pregnant." Her friend, puzzled, responded, "But didn't your husband get a vasectomy?" The woman sighed and replied, "Exactly. That's why I need to be even more careful now." A nun gets into a cab and notices that the very handsome cab driver can't stop staring at her. After a few moments, she asks, "Why do you keep staring at me?" The cab driver hesitates and says, "I have a question to ask you, but I don't want to offend you." The nun, smiling kindly, replies, "My son, you can't offend me. At my age and with all the years I've spent as a nun, I've seen and heard just about everything. There's nothing you could say or ask that would offend me." The cab driver, gaining some courage, says, "Well, I've always had a fantasy to have a nun kiss me." The nun thinks for a moment and then says, "Well, let's see what we can do about that. First, you have to be single and you must be Catholic." The cab driver, eager, says, "Yes, I'm single and Catholic." The nun responds, "All right, pull into the next alley." The cab driver, overjoyed, follows her instructions. The nun fulfills his fantasy with a kiss so passionate it would make a hooker blush. Afterward, as they continue driving, the cab driver suddenly starts crying. The nun, concerned, asks, "My dear child, why are you crying?" The cab driver, wiping his eyes, says, "Forgive me, I've sinned. I lied. I'm actually married, and I'm Jewish." The nun smiles and says, "That's all right. My name is Kevin, and I'm on my way to a fancy dress party." A very successful farmer from Texas, curious about his ancestry, decided to trace his roots. After some research, he discovered that his family originated from a small town in Ireland, where they were also farmers. Excited by the find, he packed his bags and set off to visit the town in Ireland. Upon landing in Dublin, he drove an hour outside the city and stopped in a local pub to ask around about his family. The Texan sat down, ordered a pint, and struck up a conversation with an Irishman at the bar. After sharing his story and the reason for his trip, the Irishman responded, "You don't say. I've never heard of your family, but I'm a farmer myself. Tell me, what's it like farming in Texas?" The Texan smiled and replied, "Well, farming in Texas has been quite lucrative. Let me put it this way. If you started at one end of my land and drove west, you could drive all day and still not reach the end. And if you started the next day and drove east all day, you still wouldn't reach the end. Same thing north and south. You could drive all day in any direction and never reach the edge of my farm." The Irishman took a thoughtful sip of his drink and said, I know what you mean. I've got a tractor like that, too." An old man was walking through the desert with his donkey when he arrived at a village. The villagers, seeing his tiredness and his donkey, warmly welcomed him, offering hospitality, taking care of his donkey, and providing him with a meal. During dinner, the man was surprised to be offered camel milk, which is known for its notoriously bad taste. He asked why they were drinking it, and the villagers explained that their land had been cursed with an everlasting drought. They had to save every drop of water they could for their crops. "I'm one of the wise," the old man said. "I know how to bring you rain, but first you must bring me a large bucket full of water. I need it to make more." The next morning, the villagers, desperate for rain, collected every drop of water they had saved. In the end, they had just enough to fill a bucket and handed it to the man. He took the water and walked into his host's house. There, he removed his dirty clothes and began washing them. A curious child saw him through the window and ran to tell the others. The villagers were outraged. By the time they arrived, shouting angrily, it was already too late. The old man had finished washing his clothes and was calmly hanging them up to dry. "Shame! Shame on you, old man, for wasting our precious water when our children don't even have enough to drink," growled the chief. But just as the chief finished speaking, the sky darkened and clouds gathered over the village. Rain began to pour, and it didn't stop for 5 straight days. The villagers' water reserves were replenished, and their crops were watered. The old man was celebrated as a hero, and the chief apologized profusely for doubting him. Just before he left, one of the children mustered the courage to ask, "How did you do it?" The old man smiled and said, "It's simple. This always happens when I hang my clothes to dry." An extraordinarily handsome man believed he had a divine duty to marry the perfect woman so they could have children who were beyond compare. With this mission in mind, he set off to find her. After a long search up and down the East Coast with no success, he turned his focus westward. Soon enough, he met a farmer who had 3 stunning, gorgeous daughters, each one more breathtaking than the last. The man explained his mission to the farmer and asked for permission to marry one of them. The farmer replied, "They're all looking to get married, so you came to the right place. Take your pick." The man dated the first daughter, and the next day the farmer asked how things went. "Well," said the man, "she's just a wee bit not that you can hardly notice, pigeon-toed." The farmer nodded thoughtfully and suggested the man date one of the other girls. So the man went out with the second daughter. The next day, the farmer again asked for his opinion. "Well," the man replied, "she's just a wee bit, not that you can hardly tell, cross-eyed." The farmer nodded again and suggested he try the third daughter. The man went out with her and the next morning rushed to the farmer exclaiming, "She's perfect, absolutely perfect. She's the one I want to marry." So they were married right away. Months later, their baby was born. The man went to the nursery to see the child and was horrified. The baby, while cute, had the ugliest face he'd ever seen. He immediately rushed to the farmer asking, "How could this happen, considering how perfect the parents are?" The farmer replied with a grin, "Well, she was just a wee bit, not that you could hardly tell, pregnant when you met her." Many years ago, 2 sisters, one blonde and one brunette, inherited their family's ranch. Unfortunately, after a few years, they fell on hard financial times. To save the ranch from being repossessed by the bank, they needed to purchase a bull for breeding, but they only had $600 left. The brunette sister tells her blonde sister, "If I decide to buy the bull, I'll contact you to drive out and haul it home." The brunette travels to a far-off stockyard, inspects the bull, and decides to buy it. The man offers to sell it for $599. No less. After paying him, she heads to the nearest town to send a telegram to her sister to let her know. She walks into the telegraph office and says, "I need to send a telegram to my sister, telling her I bought the bull and asking her to hitch the trailer to the truck and drive out here to help haul it back home." The operator explains, "I'd be happy to help, but it's 99 cents a word." The brunette realizes that after paying for the bull, she only has $1 left. She thinks for a moment and then says, "I want you to send the word comfortable." The operator is puzzled. How is she going to know that you need her to hook up the trailer and drive out to haul the bull if you send her just the word comfortable? The brunette smiles and says, "My sister's blonde. The word is big. She'll read it slowly. Calm for the bull." A traveling salesman finds himself stranded when his car breaks down. He walks to the nearest farmhouse and the farmer greets him. "You can stay the night, but you'll have to share a room with my daughter," says the farmer. The daughter, a striking 20-something, winks at the salesman. He eagerly replies, "I don't mind that at all, sir." The farmer then adds, "Just one thing, no funny business. If you touch her, I'll kill you." "Oh, you can count on me, sir," the salesman assures him. To make sure there are no issues, the farmer builds a wall of eggs between the two beds in the daughter's room. "Break any of those eggs," the farmer warns, "and you'll have to deal with me." Later that night, the salesman can no longer resist temptation, and he sneaks through the wall of eggs. He and the farmer's daughter enjoy a passionate night together, breaking every egg in the process. The next morning, the farmer takes a few eggs to the kitchen for breakfast, only to find that they're all empty. He turns to his daughter. "What in the world is going on with my eggs?" The salesman, now awake, joins him in the kitchen. The farmer is staring out the window at the chickens holding a shotgun. "What's going on?" the salesman asks, puzzled. The farmer grumbles, still staring out the window. "I think one of my roosters is using a condom." A missionary had spent years teaching a tribe how to farm and build, helping them become self-sufficient. As his time came to an end and he was to return home, he realized there was one thing he had never taught them: how to speak English. So he decided to teach the chief a few words. One day, he took the chief into the forest. He pointed to a tree and said, "This is a tree." The chief looked at the tree and repeated, "Tree." The missionary was pleased and moved on. They walked a little farther, and the missionary pointed to a rock. "This is a rock." The chief looked at the rock and said, "Rock." The missionary was getting really excited about the progress when he heard a rustling in the bushes. Looking over, he saw a couple engaged in intimate activity. Flustered, the missionary quickly blurted out, "Riding a bike." Without missing a beat, the chief pulled out his blowgun and shot the couple. Shocked, the missionary shouted, "How could you do that? I spent years teaching you kindness and civilization. Why would you kill them like that?" The chief simply replied, "My bike." A woman driving through the countryside in her new sports car has it break down near a farmhouse. She goes up to the house and knocks on the door. The farmer answers and she asks, "My car's broken down and I don't know what to do. Can I stay here for the night until I can get help in the morning?" The farmer says, "You can stay, but no funny business with my sons, Jed and Luke." She sees the two young men standing behind him, looking in their early 20s, and nods. "I promise no funny business," she replies. That night, after everyone has gone to bed, the woman gets a little restless and decides to visit Jed and Luke's room. She quietly whispers, "Boys, how would you like me to teach you a thing or two?" The boys look at each other confused and reply, Sure?" She smiles. "Just one rule. No getting me pregnant, so you have to wear these." She hands them a couple of rubber bands which they clumsily put around their wrists. The trio spends the night chatting and laughing, but nothing too serious. 5 years later, Jed and Luke are sitting on the porch, rocking back and forth. Jed turns to Luke and says, "Remember that blonde lady who stayed with us a few years ago and taught us some life lessons?" "Yeah," Luke replies. "How could I forget?" "Well," says Jed, "I was just wondering, do you think we still need these rubber bands?" Luke grins and says, "I reckon not. Let's just take them off." Two guys are walking through the woods when they come across a massive deep hole. "Wow, that looks really deep." "Yeah, it does. Let's toss a few pebbles in and see how deep it really is." They throw a couple of pebbles into the hole and wait, but nothing. "Geez, that's deep. Let's throw something bigger in, maybe a rock. That should make some noise." They grab a couple of large rocks, hurl them into the hole, and wait. Still nothing. Both guys exchange a look of disbelief. One of them says, "Okay, I've got it. There's a railroad tie over there in the weeds. Let's drag it over, and when we toss that in, it's got to make some noise." They struggle with the heavy tie, carry it over to the hole, and throw it in with all their might. Silence. Just then, a goat comes charging out of the woods, runs straight past them, leaps into the hole without breaking stride. The guys stare in shock. Moments later, a farmer strolls up. "Hey, you two seen my goat around here?" "You bet we did. It came running out of nowhere, jumped right into this hole. Craziest thing we've ever seen." The farmer shakes his head. "Nah, that couldn't have been my goat. My goat was chained to a railroad tie."